get started.
Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on the Global Competence Framework. My name is Natalie Foster. I'm joined by my colleague Mario Piacentini. We both work on the innovative domain assessments of PISA. I'll just give you a brief outline of how the session will work. First, I'll go through a presentation of the Global Competence Framework, so why PISA is deciding to assess global competence, how we define that, and how we're intending to assess it. And then towards the end of the session, we'll open up to questions and answers. But if you want to, at any point, send us a question, then please do so to the email address that you can see on screen now. So if you could all maybe make a note of that. So it's mariopiacentini@oecd.org. So I'll just give you a few seconds to note that down. We won't answer questions as we're going through the presentation, but once we finish, then we'll go through those.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining.
Okay, so I hope everyone's noted down Mario's email. So I'll begin. Just some context on PISA, in case people are not sure what PISA actually is. PISA is the Programme for International Student Assessment, and it's an assessment that takes place every 3 years since 2000. And we assess over 500,000 students, and they take a 2-hour test and complete a questionnaire. So the students that we assess are 15-year-olds, so those nearing the end of compulsory education in their countries. And there are now over 80 countries who participate in the PISA assessment. And the assessment normally covers the core subject areas of maths, science, and reading. But in the last few cycles, there's also been an innovative domain assessment. So in 2012, this was problem solving. In the last cycle, it was collaborative problem solving. And in this year's assessment, it's global competence. So as well as the test that students take, they also complete a questionnaire in which we collect information on their personal background, their schools, their well-being, and their motivations. And as well as the student assessment and questionnaire, teachers, principals, and parents also take a questionnaire that provides us with data on school policies, on practices, on resources and institutional factors that can also help us to explain student performance across the world. So in terms of why we've decided to assess global competence, there are really 4 main reasons that we think global competence is important. The first is that contemporary societies call for complex forms of belonging and citizenship. So people are having to interact with ideas, people, and regions that are very different to their own. But at the same time, they need to understand their own local community and have an understanding of the diversity that's within their own communities. So education for global competence can help to promote cultural awareness and also respectful interactions between people from different backgrounds. By appreciating differences in the communities that they belong to, whether that's their nation, whether it's their city or their school, education for global competence can help students to become global citizens and to live harmoniously. Secondly is that societies are changing, but also so are labour markets. Effective communication and appropriate behaviour in diverse teams are keys to success in many jobs, and they will continue to be so, particularly with the rise of technology, being able to communicate and connect with people across the world. So being ready for work in the changing labour market means that people need to understand the dynamics of globalisation that are shaping society, and that people need to be open and respectful towards others from different cultural backgrounds. So educating for global competence can also help to boost employability. Thirdly, online networks, social media, interactive technology are all giving rise to new types of learning. There are new ways to access information, and students are increasingly in control of what they learn and how they learn it. And while technology is helping people to connect across the world, it's also can have the effect that people stay within their own echo chambers. So they're not interacting with people who have different perspectives to themselves. And likewise, the unlimited access to information that the internet provides us also is sometimes paired with a basic lack of media literacy. So people are means that young people are easily fooled by partisan or biased news or fake news, which seems to be the buzzword of the moment. So global competence can also help students to use media platforms effectively and more responsibly. And finally, global competence can also help us to support the Sustainable Development Goals. It can help to form new generations of students that care about the world and who are engaged in tackling social, political, and environmental challenges. So what role do schools have in promoting global competence? Schools are really the first area in which children have the opportunity to experience the diversity of society. And so they provide students with opportunities to learn about global developments and how these affect the world and their own lives. It can teach students to develop a fact-based and critical worldview. And schools can also equip students with an appreciation of other cultures and of their own cultural identities. Schools can also provide students with concrete experiences that can facilitate international and intercultural relations, such as student exchanges. And schools can promote the value of diversity, which in turn can encourage sensitivity towards others and respectful interactions. So given the importance of global competence and the role that schools can play, the PISA assessment is really born from the need to gather data so that we can be able to answer some of the following questions, such as, are students actually able to critically examine contemporary issues of global and intercultural significance? Do they understand and appreciate cultural perspectives and also have an understanding of their own? Are they prepared to interact respectfully across cultures? And do they actually care about the world that they're going to inherit? And are they engaged to make a positive change? In addition to answers on questions about students, the PISA assessment can also provide us with data that can address more school-level questions, such as what inequalities exist in access to global competence education, what approaches are school systems worldwide taking to multicultural, intercultural, and global education, and how are teachers actually being prepared to develop students' global competence. And essentially, the fundamental goal of PISA is to support evidence-based decisions on how to improve curricula, teaching, and assessments. So I'll move on to how we actually define global competence in the PISA framework. Global competence is a multidimensional construct, and we see it as having 4 dimensions. So the first dimension of global competence is being able to examine local, global, and intercultural issues. And this dimension really refers to the ability to effectively combine knowledge and critical reasoning in order to establish an informed opinion. And in order for students to successfully do this, it requires the development of certain cognitive skills, such as selecting and weighing evidence, as well as having a level of media literacy. I think you just need to click back on the presentation, because it's not.
The presentation?
Yeah, no. I can't move to the next slide. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. The second dimension of global competence is the ability to understand and appreciate perspectives and worldviews of others. And this really refers to students' willingness and capability to understand global issues and their willingness to take others' perspectives. Now, being globally competent in this way doesn't mean that everyone should have the same perspective. Students can still retain their own cultural identity, but it's really about recognizing that perspectives and behaviors, including that of your own, is inherently shaped by various experiences and influences. The third dimension of global competence is the ability to engage in open, appropriate, and effective interactions across cultures. And this really describes what globally competent individuals do when they interact with others from cultural backgrounds different to their own. So an individual who's globally competent can understand cultural norms of different contexts and adapt their behavior and communication accordingly. And this might be through showing sensitivity towards others and a willingness to engage with other people's perspectives. And globally competent individuals make efforts to make themselves understood and to understand how others are communicating with them. The fourth and final dimension of global competence is much more action-oriented. It describes what globally competent individuals actually do, and it focuses on their role as active and responsible members of society and on their engagement to take action for collective well-being and to contribute towards sustainable development, not only in their own community, but beyond in the wider community. Now, these four dimensions of global competence are all supported by four distinct but interrelated building blocks, if you like, or they're the foundations of these four dimensions. An effective education for global competence gives students the ability to use and develop these four building blocks. So the first one is knowledge, and it's knowledge of global issues and intercultural issues. And when we talk about global issues, what we mean are those issues that affect all people, regardless of nationality and regardless of cultural background. And intercultural issues refer to those or situations where there are interactions between people of different cultural backgrounds. And if we tried to come up with a list of all relevant global and intercultural issues, it would end up being a very long list. But we've identified four content domains that broadly capture the range and complexity of such issues. And these are culture and intercultural relations, socioeconomic development and interdependence, environmental sustainability, and global institutions, conflicts, and human rights. And these four content domains are highly interdisciplinary, meaning that they can essentially be introduced into all areas of the curriculum. They can be introduced into all subjects and across all levels. So in terms of implications for curriculum, they can be incorporated into existing subjects or through specific courses. And many countries are already doing this, and perhaps unwittingly so. But really, to do this in a systematic way, teachers need preparation. They need to have clear ideas about the global and intercultural issues that they wish to address. They need to carefully and collaboratively plan curriculum to make sure this is systematic and across all grades. And perhaps most importantly, they need to develop the confidence to do so. The second one of these building blocks that supports global competence is skills, and this refers to both cognitive and socio-emotional skills. And the skills that are important for global competence include reasoning with information, communication in intercultural contexts, perspective taking, conflict resolution, and adaptability. In terms of implications for education, there are various student-centered pedagogies that can promote the critical skills that are needed for global competence. And this can range from more basic tasks such as group work, in which students need to work together to learn and evaluate their progress. It can also take the form of more organized, structured discussions and debates where students need to present evidence, argue from a particular point of view, especially in issues that are perhaps polemic or in which people have very different perspectives. And it can also be done through service learning, which is a type of activity that's strongly linked to what students have learned in the classroom, and it has more of a real-life, tangible benefit to their communities. The third one of these building blocks is attitudes. And We use attitudes to refer to the mindset that individuals adopt towards a particular person, a particular group, or institution, an issue, essentially towards a specific object or situation. And the attitudes that are important for global competence are an openness towards people from other cultural backgrounds, attitude of respect for cultural differences, and an attitude of global mindedness, which we refer to as a worldview in which one sees oneself as connected to the world community and feels a sense of responsibility for its members. So really a sense of obligation towards other people. And finally, values complete the set of building blocks that help to support global competence. The distinction between values and attitudes is that values really go beyond attitudes. They transcend specific objects or situations and serve as the standards that people use to guide their behavior and to guide their interactions with other people. And this is done both consciously and subconsciously. The values of valuing human dignity and cultural diversity contribute to global competence because they provide critical filters through which people process information and decide to engage with people from other cultures. Education has a deep influence on the values that students develop, and deciding the sorts of values that education systems should adopt and promote is obviously subject to debate. But these values are sufficiently universal and universally accepted as enshrined by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that they can provide useful frames of reference for educators to deal with issues of global and intercultural significance when they're thinking about educating for global competence. And the way that these can be integrated into schools can be by mainstreaming the respect for human dignity and for culture across all subjects, and also by cultivating the sorts of teaching and school environment that encompasses these values. But similarly to the first point about integrating global competence into curriculum, this also involves continual professional development for educators so that they feel they're able and confident enough to handle sometimes difficult conversations on ethics and discrimination, but also so that they can take into account the diversity of their learners' needs, and so that they also have a basic command of intercultural communication. So moving on to how we're actually going to measure global competence in the PISA assessment. There are two elements to the PISA assessment. There's the cognitive test and the student questionnaire. And as you can see from the figure, the cognitive test really measures, surprisingly, the most cognitive aspects of global competence, so knowledge and the cognitive skills. And the student questionnaire also gives us some information on these, but also gives us information on things that are not in the cognitive test, so more socio-emotional skills and attitudes. And although, as I've just outlined, values are important and integral to global competence, they're really beyond the scope of the PISA assessment, so they won't be directly assessed in what we're doing with PISA. So as we saw from the definition of global competence, it's a multidimensional construct, and this requires a multi-method and multi-perspective approach. PISA has developed one approach to assessing global competence, but it has to be bore in mind that this assessment obviously has needed to be tailored to the challenges of carrying out an international assessment of this scale. But as I said, our assessment is made of two parts. So there's the cognitive test and the questionnaire. And the cognitive test assesses the construct, what we refer to as global understanding, which I'll explain in a bit more detail in the following slides, but it's essentially the combination of background knowledge and cognitive skills that students need in order to successfully navigate global and intercultural issues. And this cognitive construct can be objectively scored, and in a cross-culturally valid way. And from that, we'll be able to interpret the results in ways that have concrete educational policy implications. When it comes to the questionnaire, we'll collect self-reported data on the other components of global competence that are not covered in the cognitive test, such as openness and adaptability. And unlike the cognitive test data, this data will not be used to position countries on a scale. It will rather be used to analyse the relationships between the cognitive and the affective elements of global competence. As well as the student questionnaire, there's also the principal and teacher questionnaire, which we will collect self-reported data on activities related to global and intercultural education. And this data will also be used to explore how school activities, how approaches and the environment relate to student performance on the test, and also on their self-reported knowledge, skills and attitudes from the student questionnaire. So if we zoom in on the cognitive test in a bit more detail, and I'll explain what we mean by this term of global understanding. Global understanding is a process that starts from acquiring new information. So access to information is a crucial element of global understanding. And this is because misconceptions, prejudice, and stereotypes can occur from a lack of information. And these misconceptions can then often be compounded by the fact that once beliefs have been formed, they're very difficult to change, even in light of new information. But information alone is not enough to ensure that students achieve a level of global understanding. If complex knowledge is oversimplified, or simply if people don't have the opportunity to deeper reflect upon new knowledge, then misconceptions can still occur, and stereotypes and prejudices can then still be formed. So global understanding also requires the simultaneous use of both knowledge and cognitive skills and processes. And these cognitive skills are necessary to find meaning between existing knowledge and new knowledge, to understand different perspectives and points of view, and also to make conclusions about the actions that we take. And in the PISA framework, we define 4 cognitive processes that are interrelated and that students need to develop in order to be able to have a high level of global understanding. The first one of these is the ability to evaluate information, to formulate arguments, and to explain complex situations or problems. The second of these is the ability to identify and analyze multiple perspectives, and being able to position and connect your own perspective with those of others. The third cognitive skill is the ability to understand differences in communication and recognizing the importance of socially appropriate communication conventions and adapting your style to suit. And finally, the capacity to evaluate actions and consequences and compare different courses of actions is the fourth skill that's important. And these 4 cognitive skills can broadly be mapped onto the 4 dimensions of global competence. When it comes to the assessment of the cognitive test and of these cognitive processes, each one and the cognitive processes are further divided into subcategories for the actual assessment. Each has a corresponding rubric for defining the level of development of students. So, for example, there'll be a basic level, an intermediate level, and an advanced level of development in each cognitive process. And just as an example, so it makes it a bit more concrete, if we take the cognitive process of identifying and analysing multiple perspectives and worldviews, a student that has a basic level of development in this cognitive skill would have a rather simplistic view of perspectives. They would see one person as having only one perspective. A student that has an intermediate level of development would begin to see that differences in perspectives are rooted in various backgrounds and causes. And they would also recognise that they too have their own particular worldview. A student who has an advanced level of this cognitive skill would be able to describe and interpret multiple perspectives and be able to describe the relationships between these perspectives. They'd also understand that identity is a complex phenomenon and that individuals can have more than one identity, and sometimes these identities might be in conflict with one another. And they would also recognise that they too hold their own worldview as a result of various experiences. So I know a lot of what I have said so far has been quite abstract. So in order to give a more concrete example of how this will look in the test, this is an example of one of the test units. I should say it's not an actual test unit that will be used in the assessment, as the assessment hasn't been carried out yet, but it broadly resembles what will be in the test. So the cognitive test will be 1 hour, and in that students will complete a variety of test units. And each test unit revolves around one scenario, which will have about 4 or 5 task items that relate to it. And each scenario essentially presents a case study that's relevant to 15-year-olds. So a situation that they might encounter in their day-to-day life. So for example, in this one that you can see on screen, it taps into the content knowledge of environmental sustainability, and it simulates a classroom activity in which a student is analysing information related to the debate over climate change. So in her science class, a student is reading an article featured in a local newspaper in which the author argues or uses the graph to argue that global temperatures have actually not really increased because in the last 2 years, global temperatures were actually lower than those in 2008 and 2009. So this is the scenario from which the other questions will be derived. So an example of one of these questions that might come from this scenario would be that students are asked to compare the graph from the scenario to a different graph. So the first graph compared data from the last 10 years, whereas this one compares data from the last 100 years from the same data source. And in the example, the cognitive test skill that's being assessed is the ability to evaluate information, to formulate arguments, and to explain complex situations. And the subcategory of cognitive process would be weighing information. So by comparing the two graphs, the one from the scenario and the one in this task, students should be able to infer that the researcher had actually cherry-picked the data from the last 10 years in order to send a particular message about climate change. And a globally competent student should be able to recognize that the article used in the scenario was not based on solid evidence. And then this scenario could continue in having other test items that further explore the idea of bias or influence in scientific research, and can continue talking about issues to do with environmental sustainability. So if we turn to the questionnaire items and the questionnaire element of the assessment, as I said, there'll be a student questionnaire and a questionnaire for teachers and school leaders. And in the student questionnaire, we'll collect self-reported data on the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of students. In the domain of knowledge, we'll ask them their awareness of global issues and their awareness of methods of intercultural communication. In terms of skills, we'll ask them to report how proficient they are in foreign languages, how adaptable they think they are to different cultural environments and their ability to take different perspectives. And we'll also ask them questions that will tap into ideas of how open they are towards others, their interest in learning about other cultures, and this attitude of global-mindedness. So again, just as an example, so you can see, this is one of the questionnaire items that will actually be included in the assessment. And the questionnaire will use Likert type scales when we ask students to report on their attitudes and their skills and knowledge. And these questions, the 4 questions you can see on the screen, are those that will give us an indication about students' openness towards others. And in addition to students' knowledge, skills, and attitudes, the questionnaire will also give us data on the opportunities that students feel they have to learn about global issues and other cultures at school. And will give us information on students' participation in activities actually outside of school, so whether they take part in volunteering, whether they adopt habits such as recycling, etc. And then finally, the teacher and school leader questionnaires provide us with information on more school level issues. So the kinds of beliefs that teachers hold about diversity and inclusion at school, the practices that they adopt to facilitate interactions and peer-to-peer learning, the professional experience they have and the training that they have for intercultural communication and teaching in multicultural settings, and also their self-efficacy in teaching in multicultural environments. And in terms of school level data, then it can help us to identify curriculum content, what global issues are being taught. We'll have data on school policies, how schools facilitate integration of foreign-born students, and also the activities that schools partake in to encourage multicultural learning, for example, whether they take part in exchange programs. So that's it for the presentation section. Thank you very much for listening for me talk for I don't know how long.
Half an hour.
Half an hour, okay. But yeah, if you would like any more information about the actual framework, then the framework is online or at the website you can see on the screen, and you can also have access to all of the questionnaire items that will be included in the assessment. Okay. Yes.
You can send us questions right now. For the moment, I received 2 questions, and I will answer the 2 of them. The first question was referring to Natalie's point at the beginning of the presentation about which countries are already making progress in incorporating global competence in the curriculum. And I should say that we are in the process of doing a mapping of gathering information about what types of innovations countries have introduced in the curriculum, and not just in the curriculum, but also in teacher training, in order to increase the connection between what is learned at school and what life outside of schools, or knowledge about contemporary issues, and also intercultural knowledge and the development of skills that are necessary for intercultural understanding. We have already some information. So if I had to pick one country that is like a champion on global competence and global citizenship education, we should say that 2 concepts are very much related. I would say that global competence represent the set of competencies of a global citizen. So we are not trying really to invent something new or to deviate in a substantial manner from the debate on global citizenship. So if there is one champion, this champion is Korea, and I'm saying so because Korea has clearly over the last decade set up a very clear visions about the mission of education and how education should engage in nurturing not just individuals who have a lot of knowledge, who master lots of concepts, but really good citizens and engage citizens. just to give you an example about this vision for education that Korea holds, that like Article 2 of the Basic Education Act of Korea says that education in Korea aims to assist every citizen in building up one characters based on humanitarianism and realize the public idealism of humankind. And the national curriculum that was revised in 2015 defines 4 types of desirable characteristics for individuals, and 2 of them are really much related to what we have been saying about global competence. The first one is an educated individual is one who leads a dignified life based on understanding of cultural knowledge and pluralistic values, and is one who participates in community development, possessing the spirit of consideration and sharing as a citizen communicating with the world. And these are not just like statements of goodwill, but there are actually a lot of activities that are currently underway in Korea for developing global citizenship education and general public awareness about global issues and intercultural issues. And there is a lot of work around like building education materials and sharing these education materials. They have set up networks of mentors, of teacher mentors that basically spend all their time like going from school to school in order to form other teachers and to increase sensitivities about these themes, and also practical skills to integrate existing subject with these learning objectives. And I mean, Korea is not alone. There are like many countries who are like making change, very active in this sense. Australia, for example, in the Australian curriculum emphasized the importance of developing intercultural understanding as students learn to value their own cultures, language, and beliefs, and those of others. Colombia has also like incorporates like values like justice, peace, democracy, and solidarity in its general education law. And in Croatia, the curriculum framework defines core education values that are knowledge, solidarity, identity, and responsibility, and core principles that include respect for cultural differences. Finland is also a country where like lots is going on in terms of teacher training. They're like it's human rights and democratic citizenship training is really included as part of initial training for most teachers. So as we get prepared in order to report about this data, and I should say that we will receive the data from the assessment in around June, July 2019. We will try to collect more information so that when we report on the data, we will also try to stimulate peer learning about what can be done and what countries are doing. Then I hope this answered the first question. Then I had another question that was about participation in the global competence assessment. And yes, because some people, like some of you might have heard that like some countries are not participating. And so the question was why only some countries are doing this assessment. The reason is a simple one. I mean, there are multiple reasons, but essentially this is an optional assessment. The innovative assessment are the countries who participate in PISA can decide whether or not to take the innovative assessment. And in this case, there are some reasons why several countries have decided to opt out, in particular from the cognitive part of the test. Some reasons were like that, of course, not everybody agrees on whether like these issues, like what we are proposing is a really quite a lot of change in the overall mission of schools, and not every education ministry is ready to take on this big challenge, or is simply is still debating about all the implication that this has on teachers, on teacher preparation, on the coverage of the curriculum. There are concerns about whether this imposes additional burdens on schools and on teachers. And there are also technical concerns, there are not many tests around that try to assess like difficult construct like perspective taking. So there is still some uncertainties about the technical quality of the assessment. And since PISA is a big endeavor, there are thousands of students who pass the test in each country. Some countries are simply like, they want to like wait, see how solid the test is, and then eventually consider the participation later on. And yes, okay, I got another question that is related to this one on participation, and nothing else for the moment. You, oops, another one. Hope you not. Yes, for the again on sharing on the material, there is a dedicated web page in the PISA website where you can find the framework and the questionnaire and all the questionnaire. Okay. I have another question about whether like schools can actually take the assessment. We are not in a condition now to release like the cognitive test, the scenarios that Natalie described, because we can't release this material before the actual assessment. We have started to build like a large pool of scenarios, case studies that potentially can be applied by teachers themselves. What we encourage like schools and school networks to do is to consider using our questionnaire for their own assessment. The questionnaire is public information. We have already shared it with several schools and school networks, and we only require that people get in touch with us and give us a sense of why they are using our material, and so that we can actually learn something from their own assessment. Another question. Yes, about environmental challenges. We have awareness of sustainable consumption. You will see that in the questionnaire there are some questions that are about like students' awareness of particular issues like sustainable consumption or climate change. It's this is just one of the 4 knowledge domains that we have included in the assessment, so it's not fully centered on that. There are like, even in the scenarios, there are approximately, I would say, a bit more than 1/4 of the scenarios that are about environmental issues, and the capacity of students to like, for example, to understand like scientific debate about climate change, but again, we have some questions. You can go through the questionnaire and eventually like suggest us how we should improve the questionnaires for future rounds. And it's also possible that we, as you know, probably know, we also have a science assessment in PISA, and we will try like to find synergies between this assessment and the science assessment in order to explore a little bit more awareness about environmental issues and risks.
So just to build on Mario's point there, one of the questions in the questionnaire is how we ask students how easy they think it would be for them to perform the following tasks. So we ask them to, if they were to explain how carbon dioxide emissions affect climate change, or to discuss the consequences of development on the environment, and then they can say whether they think they couldn't do this, whether they would struggle to do it on their own, whether they think they could do it with a bit of effort, or they could do it easily. So there are various questions like this that you can, if you look through the framework, you'll be able to see the questions that we're actually asking students.
Yeah, I've got another questions about the sampling, and it's essentially like the the students who take global competence are students who participate in the core PISA assessment. So it's a representative sample of 15-year-old students in all countries. We have samples in each country that are meant to that are designed in order to achieve this representativeness. So we have in some countries like 7,000 students. In larger countries, we have larger samples above 10,000 students. And the sampling procedure is it's a stratified sampling of schools and randomized selection of students in each schools. Like there are about 30, maximum 30 students per school. But this is all documented in the PISA technical document. What I can say is that all schools that the samples are truly representative, so all types of schools are included, like both private and public schools, for example. I'm just waiting a little bit to see if more questions come out. Otherwise. And you have our emails. So if you need more information, just don't hesitate to write to me and Natalie. I will be happy to know more about your work and the possibilities of collaboration. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.